25 October 1942, the Pacific. While Guadalcanal may be the United States' first major land offensive in this war, the fate of the men fighting on the island is, in large measure, being decided by the battle the Navy is waging at sea. For both the Americans and the Japanese, the ability to land troops and supplies on the island and to prevent the other side from doing so has become the focal point of the struggle. The long-running battle picks up new urgency after Japanese naval commanders receive an erroneous report that Imperial troops have captured Henderson Field. With the Marine bombers based on Henderson taken out of the equation, they feel victory is certain and that the time has come for a decisive showdown. The Japanese Second Fleet, consisting of 4 battleships, 4 heavy cruisers, 3 aircraft carriers, and their destroyer escorts, sails for Guadalcanal. Soon after leaving, Vice Admiral Kondo Nobutake learns that the Army has not taken Henderson, but has instead been soundly defeated. Despite the discouraging news, he continues on his course, confident that his force will be more than enough to finish off the American fleet and put Henderson out of commission. The American battle groups are centered around the carriers Enterprise and Hornet and the battleship Washington, and 26 October finds them frantically searching for Nobutake's approaching fleet. Almost simultaneously, Japanese and American patrols spot each other's carriers. Aerial strike forces are immediately launched. With the Enterprise temporarily hidden in a squall, the Japanese concentrate their attack on the Hornet. Several bomb hits and 2 torpedoes in her engine room leave the foundering ship dead in the water. Leaving the shattered Hornet to be finished off the next day, another flight of Japanese planes finds the Enterprise and launches its attack. Faring far better than her doomed sister, the Enterprise sustains 2 hits but is able to withdraw in operational condition. Meanwhile, aircraft from the 2 American carriers give the Imperial Navy a taste of its own medicine. Dive bombers and torpedo bombers inflict heavy damage to the fleet carrier Shokaku, rendering her useless for flight operations. They also deal a devastating blow to the heavy cruiser Chimkuma and leave a gaping hole in the flight deck of the light carrier Zuiho. The destruction of the Wasp leaves the Enterprise the only American fleet carrier in the Pacific. While that may be a tactical victory for the Japanese, it is also a costly one. The Japanese carrier's air complement is so devastated that there aren't enough planes to launch an effective strike on Henderson Field. Meanwhile, the situation on the ground has turned decidedly against the Japanese. Unable to land sufficient reinforcements, and with the Marines attacking east and west out of their beachhead, Japanese commanders feel control of the island slipping from their hands. On 7 November, Japanese commanders land an advance party west of the Americans at Tassafaronga and intend to land the rest of the 38th Division after Henderson Field has been taken out. That task is assigned to Admiral Hiroaki Abe and his task force en route to Guadalcanal. On 12 November, the Japanese step up their air attacks against targets both on Guadalcanal and offshore in Iron Bottom Sound, where tons of Allied and Japanese shipping have settled to their final resting place. On 12 November, Rear Admiral Richmond Turner dispatches Rear Admiral Daniel Callahan with 8 destroyers and 5 cruisers to intercept Abe's force and prevent the bombardment of Henderson. In the pre-dawn hours of 13 November, the 2 forces blunder into each other. A quick, vicious duel ensues. Both sides lose 2 cruisers and 4 destroyers, but almost all of the Japanese ships suffer damage, including Abe's flagship, the battleship Hiei. On the 14th, aircraft from Henderson Field score heavily against Japanese transports, and American commanders, realizing the battle is at a decisive point, bring up the battleships Washington and South Dakota. The 2 forces clash again. The South Dakota is hit and forced out of the battle, but the Washington fires salvo after salvo into the Kirishima, the last Japanese battleship in the area. Within minutes, the massive Rising Sun dreadnought is plummeting to the ocean floor. The operation the Japanese launched in hopes of destroying the American fleet and gaining total control of Guadalcanal has been a disaster for the Imperial Navy. Not only have they failed in their attempts to strengthen their deteriorating position on the island, They have lost their advantage on the seas. If they cannot regain the upper hand, Guadalcanal will be lost. That, most assuredly, will have implications reaching far beyond the battle for a single island. November 1942, French North Africa. With Allied troops ashore in Algeria and French Morocco, the first goal of Operation Torch has been accomplished. Still, there is no time for the Allies to congratulate themselves. They landed planning a fast drive across North Africa, and if that is to happen, the Vichy French troops positioned between the Allies and the Nazis must be persuaded to lay down their arms. Unfortunately, General Henri Giraud, the man the Allies had counted on to convince his countrymen to yield, seems to hold little sway with the French in North Africa. It has become apparent that Admiral Jean-François Darlan, commander of the French Navy, is the only man in a position to speak for the Vichy government. It is critical that he be brought on board quickly if the Allied plan is to succeed. Lieutenant General Dwight Eisenhower learns quickly that commanding the combined Allied force can involve more political problems than military ones. The British are against dealing with Darlan, as is Admiral William Leahy of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. They believe Darlan is an opportunist who will do or say anything to save his own skin. Even more virulently opposed to dealing with Darlan or anyone else in the Vichy regime is Charles de Gaulle, the commander of the Free French forces in England. While Eisenhower has no delusions about Darlan or his motives, he makes his decision based purely on military necessity. Right now, he needs Darlan in order to accomplish the mission at hand. On the 10th, as General George Patton's forces begin moving into the outskirts of Casablanca, Darlan broadcasts an order to all Vichy forces in North Africa to cease resistance. What had loomed as a major battle becomes instead a simple walkthrough. Hitler is furious and orders German troops to occupy Vichy France, and on the 11th, the Wehrmacht pours across the border. The French offer no resistance. As the hobnailed boots of the Wehrmacht sound on the cobblestone streets of southern France, Italian forces occupy the island of Corsica, and the Luftwaffe feverishly transports troops and equipment into French-held Tunisia. For all intents and purposes, the country of France ceases to exist. The drive to the east begins with a landing by British troops who capture Bougie on the 11th, and an airborne assault against Bon on the 12th. There is little resistance, and the Allies rushed reinforcements to secure these forward positions. On the 13th, Darlan gets his reward for dealing with the Allies. A formal agreement recognizing him as the head of the French civil government in North Africa. Giraud is named leader of French military forces. While not an ideal arrangement, it has certainly saved the lives of many American and British soldiers. With political necessities set aside, Eisenhower is now able to focus his attention on the Germans. Their build-up in Tunisia has been more rapid than Allied military planners believed possible. By the 15th, they have over 10,000 troops in place, and what was supposed to be a relatively easy drive into Tunisia is proving much more difficult. For the moment, however, the Luftwaffe poses the greatest threat to continued Allied success. Enjoying overwhelming air superiority, German air crews are able to strike at Allied supply lines with impunity. Several critical supply ships are sunk during the landing operations at Bougie, and almost no Allied movement on land or sea goes uncontested from the air. Although there are far tougher tests ahead, Eisenhower is pleased with the success of the operation thus far. He has successfully negotiated difficult political obstacles. His raw recruits have given a good accounting in their first taste of battle. Perhaps most important, however, the Allied combined command structure has worked wonderfully. As word spreads of progress in North Africa, the peoples of the United States and Britain share Eisenhower's optimism. They know it will be a long, bloody struggle to rid the world of Hitler and his fascist brood, But with Operation Torch, they have taken the first step toward Berlin, the first step toward victory, and perhaps most important, for the GIs on the ground, it is the first step toward home. November 1942, Stalingrad. For months, the German Sixth Army, under the command of General Friedrich von Paulus, has continued to expend huge quantities of men and equipment, trying to capture Stalingrad, and they have nearly succeeded in doing so. But the cost of this conquest has been enormous. The Russians' defense of Stalingrad has been fanatical, and the campaign, which was to have concluded in late August, now threatens to drag on into the winter. With his supply lines stretched to the breaking point and his men exhausted, von Paulus finds himself in command of an army too weak and weary to advance any further. It is precisely this point in the conflict that the Russians have been waiting for. At 7:32 a.m., 3,500 guns of the Soviet 5th Tank Army Artillery split the icy morning air 110 miles northwest of Stalingrad. This is the opening barrage of a carefully planned and perfectly timed counteroffensive designed to cut off the German salient at the route. Despite the temptation to throw every available soldier into the defense of the city, Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin and his Deputy Commander-in-Chief Georgy Zhukov have been building up reserves of men and machinery, releasing the bare minimums necessary to keep Stalingrad from being overrun. Now, as the big guns ease up, the first of nearly 1 million fresh Russian troops, hungry for the blood of the enemy, charge into the Axis front lines. In what hindsight may reveal to be a terrible mistake, the Nazis, intent on employing German soldiers in the battle at Stalingrad, have left the lines to the north and south of the city in the hands of the much less formidable Romanian armed forces. The 3rd Romanian Army catches the brunt of the attack and virtually crumbles under the onslaught. In no time, the Soviet troops have broken through and begin driving hard and fast to the southwest. By the time the sun comes up on 20 November, the Russians are ready to begin Phase 2 of the counteroffensive. 25 miles to the south of Stalingrad, elements of the Russian 51st, 57th, and 64th Armies attack to the northwest. Once again, it is Romanian troops, specifically the 4th Army, trying to hold the line. Despite assistance from the German 4th Panzer Army, they are only slightly more successful. The Russians make rapid advances. With the Red Army driving both north and south, it quickly becomes clear to General von Paulus and the German High Command in Berlin what the Soviet intentions are: to link up their two forces to the west of Stalingrad, and in doing so, surround the 6th Army. In desperation, von Paulus's commanders order him to break off his engagement in the city and prepare to attack to his rear. But before he can move into position, the order is rescinded. Adolf Hitler, unwilling to allow retreat under any circumstance, has ordered the 6th Army to stay put. By 21 November, the Red Army troops pushing south have broken through on a 50-mile front and are continuing to advance. Those pushing north encounter slightly stiffer resistance, but in the end, the sheer size of the attacking force is too much for the Axis troops, and the Russians continue to run roughshod over any opposition. On 23 November, near the town of Kalach, the Soviet forces link up, cutting German supply lines and trapping the entire 6th Army. Stalin and Zhukov are more than pleased. They have won the battle, taking a page from the German military genius Clausewitz, a classic pincers movement executed at the precise moment the enemy, overextended and exhausted, is most vulnerable. Still, having won the battle, the Soviets are a long way from having won the war, and the road ahead is paved with peril. Stalin and Zhukov believe they have trapped 65,000 Germans. In fact, the number is closer to 300,000, which will make the task of clearing out the encircled area a great deal more difficult than they anticipate. Nevertheless, Stalin cannot help but be pleased. In a mere 4 days, he has gone from the brink of disaster to glorious victory. He has turned the tide of the battle and very possibly the entire war. Amid the horrors and heartache that war inevitably brings, there also exists a fertile soil in which the human spirit can grow, attaining sometimes heroic proportions. Perhaps the most surprising aspect of the call to arms in this war is not the noble actions of the young men drawn away from their homes by the need to exorcise an external evil, but the way it has revitalized and unified the United States. The people on the home front have stood behind their warriors, not just in word, but in deed, turning factories and laboratories into battlefields, sacrificing many of the comforts to which they have grown accustomed, so that their brothers, sons, fathers, and husbands might return home safe and victorious. As Americans grew more conscious of the hostilities brewing in Europe and Asia, FDR began steering the national economy from a peacetime to a wartime footing. Despite rampant isolationism and at considerable political risk, he declared that the U.S. would become the arsenal of democracy and began the process of ramping up the country's manufacturing capability not for the domestic good, but for the sake of beleaguered people around the world. As the fighting raged overseas, the U.S. government went through several stages of attitude and policy regarding the release of armaments to foreign countries. Initially, the public insisted America remain neutral, and under a cash-and-carry policy, any country with the means could purchase American goods and weapons. As public sentiment turned more decisively against the Axis powers, the policy shifted to the more generous Lend-Lease plan. To keep up with the increased demand, primarily from Great Britain, production of war goods and the ships in which to carry them more than doubled within a year. The final step in the transformation of the country from the economic wreck of the 30s to the manufacturing juggernaut of today began on 7 December 1941. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor instantly awakened the United States to the inevitability of its participation in the war. Almost overnight, the demeanor of the country changed. With President Roosevelt's declaration of war, the national spirit galvanized. Everyone understood that it was not only the soldiers, but the people at home who would have to fight the war. People across the country forgot their suddenly insignificant peacetime woes and, leaving behind the lives they'd always known, flocked to the great manufacturing centers of the Northwest and Midwest. They converged on shipyards, factories, ironworks, and converted automobile plants, and began churning out planes, tanks, guns, and ammunition by the shipload, with men and women working side by side on the manufacturing lines. Focusing on the needs of the military, the nation is instituting a restrictive rationing program. People are farming in their own backyards, and the nation is mounting the greatest recycling movement the world has ever known. Just as important as manufacturing to the process is the act of invention. Scientists, engineers, and technicians bring their training and ingenuity to bear in government-sponsored think tanks, improving existing weapons and creating new ones they hope will end the war that much sooner. Extraordinary efforts have gone into shipbuilding. Under the aegis of the U.S. Navy, rapidly mass-produced transports called Liberty ships carry men and materiel across the vast expanses of ocean to the fields of battle. With the coming of the Second World War, it seems as if the United States has found its destiny. Americans have come together, lifting the precious raw materials from their land, shaping them with their minds and hands, and turning them against their enemies. Those who would trample the freedom of people around the world are now being brought to task, not only by an alliance of countries united in arms, but by one great nation, united in spirit. November 1942, New Guinea. With the minds of the American public fixed on the battles raging in North Africa and on Guadalcanal, a good deal less attention is paid to the struggle being waged here. By all measures, it is a conflict as great as any in this war. For months, Australian and American troops have been fighting in malaria-ridden jungles to keep the Japanese from securing this vital island, which lies within striking distance of Australia. The key to the island is Port Moresby on the southeast coast. Foiled in an attempt to launch an amphibious assault on Moresby at the Battle of Coral Sea, the Japanese decided to try an overland route. On 21 July, they landed 5,000 troops near Buna and Gona on the north coast and began the 130-mile drive inland toward Moresby to the south. Fighting on the Kokoda Trail, the Japanese steadily pushed back the Australian troops charged with stopping them. Although they were seasoned veterans of North Africa, the Australians were wholly unprepared to fight in this environment. Inadequate training in jungle warfare was only the beginning. The Australian troops lacked everything from sufficient firepower to proper uniforms. Many veterans of North Africa still wore knee-length khakis, making their silhouettes against the dense green jungle an easy target for Japanese snipers, and their bare legs easy prey for the millions of mosquitoes. For 2 months, the battle raged, exhausting men and resources on both sides. Although the Japanese on the front outnumbered the Australians nearly 5-1, fierce fighting, rampant disease, and major supply problems severely sapped their strength. On 26 September, the Japanese, having advanced within 30 miles of Port Moresby, began to withdraw. At the same time the Japanese started to fall back, the Australians received some much-needed assistance. The U.S. Army's 32nd Division came ashore at Port Moresby. Under the command of Major General Edwin Harding, the men of the Red Arrow Division were to drive north toward Buna on the Kappa Kappa Trail, while to the west, the Australians pushed the Japanese back up the Kokoda Trail. These two trails are, in fact, nothing more than that. At best, only 3 feet wide, they alternate from jagged, rocky ridges to dense jungle. Living and fighting in these conditions is almost unbearable. Everything the men need to fight and to live must be carried in by hand. Using ropes, artillery pieces are hauled up steep mountain paths. Ammunition is carried on the backs of the men or by friendly natives. On 2 November, after a month of fighting to regain lost ground, the Australians captured Kokoda Village, the key to the Owen Stanley Range. Access to the airstrip here makes supplying the troops much easier than carrying everything up the treacherous switchback trails. The celebrations were brief as the weary Aussies moved on, keeping the pressure on the retreating Japanese troops. By mid-November, the Japanese had fallen back to their strongholds at Gona and Buna, and the heavily reinforced garrisons there were well prepared for attacks by the advancing Allied columns. The Australians attacking Gona met ferocious resistance. Japanese units fought to the last man in desperate attempts to hold even the tiniest piece of ground. The Japanese were able to blunt most of the Australian advances until 25 November, when Allied airstrikes followed by a massive artillery barrage cracked the defenses, and the Australians were able to make significant gains. The Americans, however, have been stymied. The Japanese forces at Buna have taken everything the men of the 32nd can give and still have not budged. Although the Japanese have fought well, the American problems are, as much as anything, due to the fact that the men are exhausted, suffering from malaria and dysentery, their boots and clothes rotting, their weapons failing due to the constant exposure to mud and water. The men simply lack the strength to crack the Japanese defense. To General Douglas MacArthur, however, these explanations sound like empty excuses. From his desk in Australia, he is certain that the Americans' lack of success is due to poor leadership, and dispatches Lieutenant General Robert Eichelberger to take command of the attack on Buna. The stage is now set for what is sure to be one of the toughest battles yet for this vital island. The Japanese desperately try to reinforce their garrison as the Allies slowly pick away at the defenses. The men on the ground know all too well how tough the Japanese will fight to retain their foothold here. On the other hand, they are determined to wrest it from their control. They have suffered far too long in the most miserable conditions to be denied now. If driving the Japanese out of Buna and Gona is what they must do to get off this godforsaken island, then that is exactly what they intend to do. 12 December 1942, Berlin. For nearly 3 weeks, Adolf Hitler, conqueror of Europe and the leader of what he believes to be God's chosen people, has lived with the unthinkable indignity of having the entire German Sixth Army held captive by a nation he believes to be racially, morally, and militarily inferior: Soviet Russia. In mid-November, Hitler and the Sixth, under the command of General Friedrich von Paulus, seemed to be on the brink of completing their continental conquest. Despite exhausted troops and supply shortages, Stalingrad, the keystone that would surely topple the walls of Fortress Russia, seemed to be theirs for the taking. Then, in a turn of events Hitler and the Nazi high command thought impossible, the Red Army, driving from the north and south, encircled the city, and with it an entire German army. Hitler is appalled. Still, he is convinced that the Russian success is merely a temporary setback, and in keeping with this reasoning, he and his commanders are committed to taking back the initiative. 60 miles south of Stalingrad, at the city of Kotelnikovo, 13 German divisions fire the opening shots of Operation Winter Storm. Spearheading the attack, the tanks of the 23rd Panzer Division smash into the unsuspecting and ill-prepared Soviet 51st Army. Driving hard across the snow-covered plains, the Nazi tanks and troops smash into the Russian defenses, driving them back on their heels. With reinforcements several days away, the Third Reich troops enjoy advances as rapid as the early days of Operation Barbarossa. In Moscow, Joseph Stalin and his deputy commander-in-chief, Georgy Zhukov, are stunned at the sudden turn of events. Still, they keep their wits about them. Rather than panic and divert masses of men and materiel to drive the Germans back, they dispatch enough support to slow the attack, and on 14 December, they begin the next phase of their plan to drive the Nazis out of Russia. From the area near Kalach, where the Russians had completed their encirclement of Stalingrad, Soviet troops begin driving to the southwest. Once again, Stalin and Zhukov have chosen a weak point in the German lines, and as the Nazis continue to push north toward their besieged comrades, the Red Army begins to move rapidly to the south. For days, the two forces continue their counter-movements, both advancing. But as the respective battles drag on, the Germans seem to be slowing, while the Russians build up steam. By 19 December, the Wehrmacht has stalled completely. They continue to fight, but make no headway. Inside the Stalingrad pocket, the besieged Nazi troops can hear the guns of their would-be rescuers, but tired, starving, and short of fuel, they too are unable to break through the Soviet circle. Meanwhile, the Red Army continues to advance to the south, and it is becoming apparent to German generals trying to break through to Stalingrad, as well as the generals in the Caucasus region to the southeast, that the Soviets are headed to the town of Rostov, where the Don River flows into the sea. As Christmas comes and goes, it becomes clear to these generals that the attempt to liberate the Sixth Army trapped at Stalingrad has failed. But Hitler and his advisors refuse to acknowledge the obvious, and all talk of withdrawal is summarily dismissed as cowardice. The field generals are beginning to wonder if the Fuhrer and his cronies are looking at the same maps they are, or even the lowest private plotting the movements of the Red Army would be able to see what the Soviet intentions are: to drive to Rostov, and in doing so isolate all the German troops east of a line stretching from Stalingrad to the Black Sea. This time, however, if they are successful, Stalin and Zhukov will trap not just an army, but an entire army group, including the men who have fought so valiantly to save their suffering brothers at Stalingrad.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
It has been a year since those fateful words echoed over the airwaves of the country, forever changing the lives of Americans everywhere. Since those black days at the end of 1941, America has changed dramatically. Gone are the laments of isolationist groups demanding America stay out of foreign wars. They have given way to an enormous surge of patriotism and unity of purpose. Americans everywhere have done whatever is necessary to bolster the war effort, and nowhere is this more apparent than in Hawaii. In the hours after the attack, things here looked bleak indeed. Far removed from the security of the continental U.S., and with the bulk of the fleet burning in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, the symbol of American strength in the Pacific, was a plum ripe for the picking. Through the extraordinary sacrifices of the people here, however, that is no more. Hawaii has been transformed from a vacation paradise to an armed camp bristling with activity. The beautiful beaches where tourists used to frolic in the sun and surf are now heavily patrolled and strung with miles of barbed wire. What had been a vibrant nightlife has been nearly snuffed out by a dusk till dawn blackout order. Along with reading and writing, school children have daily air raid drills and learn how to use a gas mask. The most dramatic change, however, is to be found at Pearl Harbor itself. Captain H.N. Wallen, the Bureau of Ships expert on salvage and repair, and the men under his command have done what anyone here a year ago would have deemed impossible. Massive dreadnoughts that were little more than smoldering wrecks slowly bleeding oil into the Pacific are now well on their way to renewed service. The men doing the work are members of Naval Construction Battalions, or Seabees. After the attack, the Seabees' ranks swelled as thousands of skilled construction workers volunteered to do whatever was needed to carry the war back to the Japanese. Divers, welders, and mechanics, working 24 hours a day above and below the water, labor to restore the proud old battle wagons to their former glory. The fact that this is possible at all is in large measure thanks to mistakes made by the Japanese. Intoxicated by the sight of Battleship Row and Hickam Field in flames, the Japanese pilots neglected to target Pearl's dry docks or repair shops. Certain that they had done irreparable damage to the fleet, they failed to ensure these vital facilities could not be used to salvage the wreckage. Of the 8 battleships damaged in the attack, 5 have been salvaged. The California, the Nevada, the West Virginia, the Tennessee, and the Maryland are all nearing operational status. However, the Utah, the Arizona, and the Oklahoma have seen their last battle. Now, a year after their entry into the war, Americans everywhere have pulled together like never before. But for the people who were here on December 7th, 1941, there is a special sense of pride. Rather than listening to the proclamations of Japanese military leaders who boasted of the utter destruction of the Pacific Fleet, they have taken what was a disaster and turned it into a triumph. They are certain that victory will be theirs and that the Japanese will soon feel the wrath of guns they thought they had silenced forever. Of all the industrial developments that have resulted from America's involvement in the Second World War, there is perhaps none so impressive as the advances in the construction of commercial vessels. Known as the Liberty Fleet, these vessels are the fruits of the labor of thousands of workers. Their contribution to the war effort, while not glamorous, is crucial. They have devised a means of building ships faster than Hitler's submarine wolf packs can sink them. The Liberty ships, or as President Roosevelt likes to call them, ugly ducklings, are based upon a design submitted to the U.S. by Britain. It differed from traditional shipbuilding in that the steel plates of the hull were welded rather than riveted together. While welding takes considerably less time and manpower than riveting, it yields a joint of comparable strength. Now, welding has been adopted by shipyards across the country. The building process has been further expedited by individual workers who have begun to figure out ways to perform their tasks faster and better. Techniques developed in one shipyard quickly spread to others, honing the process down until the time it takes to complete a single ship is incredibly brief. In California's Kaiser shipyards, workers build a ship in just 4 days and 15 hours. This kind of performance is possible because Liberty ships are not built from the ground up in a single shipyard. Instead, parts of the ships are prefabricated around the country. Engines, steel plates, and other necessities are shipped to the coast from the country's interior. Thus, manpower from all over the country can be applied to a single ship simultaneously, completing in 2 or 3 weeks what once took an entire year. The demand for ships has created an army of new shipbuilders. They are a hodgepodge of skilled and unskilled laborers. Housewives work alongside their husbands, as men and women alike are trained in welding and the use of heavy equipment. As the workers watch the product of their labors slide into the water, they know that they are doing more than launching a ship. They are empowering the entire American industrial base. Medicine, weapons, rations, and all the tools of war sit waiting on docks in anticipation of each Liberty ship that floats off the line. The men and women who are in charge of shipping these items out, secretaries, clerks, longshoremen, work in concert to quickly deliver hundreds of tons of supplies overseas. Though the Liberty ships can achieve a speed of only 12 knots, they seem an appropriate symbol of the war on the home front. The value of the Liberty fleet does not stem from its speed, but, like the nation which built it, from the strength of a large group of individuals pushing steadily toward a common goal. "24 December 1942, North Africa. Christmas Eve. In this annual time of peace, the world remains at war. Nowhere is the irony of a joyless world more apparent than in North Africa. There, Christians face off against Christians. In the desert quiet, it is occasionally possible for soldiers on the front lines to hear the soft caroling of the enemy. The German troops are old hands at celebrating the homiest of holidays on foreign shores. It is, for many of them, their 4th Christmas at war. Across the lines are the British, like the Germans, well versed in the observation of holidays far from home. England is, after all, a colonial power. Those in its military are used to serving overseas and bring to the holiday season food and songs so familiar that they seem a part of each and every soldier. For the Americans, however, Christmas in wartime is a new experience. The American military, more than any other, is made up not of professional soldiers, but of citizens whose everyday lives have been interrupted by history. Now, halfway around what must seem a very large world, they shiver in the desert chill, looking for a star to guide them home. After a string of military and diplomatic victories, the scuttlebutt among American troops in North Africa is that they will be home, certainly by next Christmas, if not before. The defeat of the Nazis at El Alamein and the acquiescence of the Vichy French make driving the Nazis out of Africa seem a foregone conclusion. There is encouraging news from Russia, from the Coral Sea, and even Guadalcanal. Around the fires in the American camps, the feeling is, now that the Yanks have entered the fray, the war is nearly over. It is a comforting fantasy, this sudden victory, one that is more readily believed the lower one gets in the chain of command. Soldiers on the front lines believe it almost absolutely. In the Allied High Command, the planning is for a much longer, protracted war. Still, to so many suddenly so far from home, and for those waiting back home whose nights are filled with dread, seasonal optimism is the light guiding their way through the wilderness. Though it is almost certainly a star promising more than can be delivered, thousands of uprooted Americans are perfectly glad to embrace this feeling as an article of faith. December 1942, Guadalcanal. General Alexander Patch's 14th Corps relieves General Vandegrift's 1st Marine Division. The men of the 1st, who have been here far longer than was ever intended, are exhausted. Left holding the bag when the Navy pulled out, the Marines, short on supplies, had to fight not only the Japanese, but malaria, dysentery, and numerous other maladies. Although they are exhausted, the men eagerly climb the cargo nets to board the ships that will carry them to a well-deserved rest in Australia. The 14th Corps, made up of the Army's 23rd and 25th Divisions and elements of the 2nd Marine Division, goes about settling in on the island. Except for small skirmishes, there is a general lull in the fighting as the fresh troops take up their positions. The Japanese continue to attempt resupply of their forces, but with little success, as American planes send tons of shipping to the bottom. The Japanese resort to dumping crates of supplies overboard in hopes they will wash ashore. Few ever reach the island. Although both sides have about 20,000 men on Guadalcanal, the Japanese are not nearly as well equipped or well fed as the fresh troops of the 14th Corps. Patch and his commanders plan to take advantage of this and design a massive offensive to drive the Japanese off the island for good. On 17 December, the attack begins against the Japanese stronghold of Mount Austin. Rising some 1,500 feet southwest of Henderson Field, Austin is covered with fortified Japanese positions. The Americans find the going rough from the beginning. Machine guns hidden deep in pillboxes and obscured by the jungle shower the advancing GIs with hot lead. The men of the 2nd Battalion, 132nd Regimental Combat Team, who were not so long ago weekend warriors from Illinois, take the brunt of the battle. It quickly turns into a bloody stalemate. On 20 December, the commander of the 2nd Battalion, Lieutenant Colonel William Wright, is killed. His men, hot for revenge, press forward with renewed vigor and by Christmas Eve have reached the machine gun-protected perimeter of the Japanese defenses. Alarmed at the casualty rate sustained by the infantry units driving into the teeth of the Japanese defenses, Patch orders them to fight a holding action, while bombers and artillery soften up the enemy's fortifications. The 14th Corps' big guns pound the Japanese, who seek shelter in their hardened bunkers. In Japan, the High Command realizes with the American Navy strangling their supply routes to the island and their forces under heavy attack, that all hope for holding Guadalcanal is lost. On 31 December, they issue an order for the garrison to withdraw to other islands in the Solomon Chain. All of this is unknown to General Patch and his men. They cannot conceive of the Japanese giving up the island. Based on the fanatical determination of the troops defending Mount Austin, the Americans are convinced that the Japanese will, to a man, fight to the death. In fact, they have given the Americans no reason to believe otherwise. Although they know the battle is lost, the defenders on Austin continue to fight as viciously as before. Casualties mount as the Americans drive the Japanese from their positions, one by one. Despite the fact that his troops are making progress, Patch believes they are still in for a long, tough fight. Although the Japanese troops are hungry and short of supplies, they are exacting a heavy toll for every inch of ground. He fears that driving them from the island will take months, claiming thousands of American lives. What he does not know is that he may be, instead, very close to claiming the first American land victory in the Pacific. December 1942. In Algiers, the air is thick with intrigue as the French High Commissioner of North Africa, Admiral Jean Darlan, is shot dead in his outer office. After 2 years of fruitful dalliance in the Nazi camp, Darlan had only recently begun collaborating with the Allies. He was, in many ways, a man without a country, and his murder takes no one by surprise. Still, questions abound and rumors of Byzantine plots fill the African night. The answers lie with the killer, a graduate of an American-sponsored intelligence school and a self-described French patriot. French patriotism is, these days, difficult to define. France is an occupied nation. The remains of the French Empire are administered by the Vichy regime of Marshal Henri Pétain. It is a government of civil administrators and figureheads who operate in the shadow of their Nazi occupiers, but a government that nonetheless believes it can chart the best route to French independence. Darlan began the war as a sworn supporter of Pétain, which made him a sworn enemy of the Free French, who dismissed Pétain and his consort as enemy collaborators. But by the time Operation Torch brought the first Americans to North Africa, Darlan seemed a likely candidate for conversion to the Allied cause. So, in secret meetings prior to the invasion, he signed on with the Allies, surrendering Vichy's forces in North Africa and making possible the rapid movement of the U.S. troops through French territory and up to the German lines. Though Darlan almost certainly thought himself acting in the best interests of France, he suffered the fate of most turncoats. He was ostracized not just by his former allies, but by his new Confederates as well. The Nazis loathed him for his sudden shift, and the Allies distrusted him because there is always the danger that a man who changes sides once will change sides again. When Darlan is assassinated, French General Henri Giraud, installed by Eisenhower to keep an eye on Darlan, assumes leadership of the French North African forces without missing so much as an hors d'oeuvre. Not surprisingly, rumors abound. The idea that Darlan was killed by a lone assassin is difficult for anyone to accept. Simply stated, too many people wanted him dead. What quickly becomes clear is that the French government in North Africa has little interest in pursuing all the possibilities. Darlan is shot on Christmas Eve, and the unseen and almost anonymous assassin is tried and found guilty the next morning. Before the sun rises on the 26th, he is dead, executed by firing squad. What remains of l'affaire Darlan is sure to be one of the enduring mysteries of this war, a whodunit with the last pages torn roughly away. For now, all that is certain is that in French North Africa, the line between the sides is a bit more clearly drawn than it was only a few days ago. In the future, anyone considering crossing over will be wise to think twice. January 1943, Saint-Nazaire. Bomber squadrons of the 8th Army Air Force approached the west coast of France in an attempt to destroy the German sub-pens located there. This second Allied air raid on Saint-Nazaire is the latest step in the young science of anti-submarine warfare. Pilots and commanders have constantly devised and tested new tactics in their efforts to protect Allied shipping from Hitler's murderously effective submarine wolf packs. Although the bomber groups of the 8th were initially assigned to Britain to assist in the war against the Luftwaffe in January 1942, Churchill's new anti-U-boat warfare committee decided by August they would also be used to combat Hitler's submarines. Both the U.S. and Britain agree the most certain means of destroying a submarine is to catch it at the surface and engage it directly. But German submariners know that safety lies in stealth and have been extremely successful in concealing themselves. With monthly U-boat kills peaking in the low 20s, the Anti-U-Boat Committee has decided that rather than hunting individual members of the wolf packs, the fight should be taken to their dens. With its excellent access to the ocean, the Germans have lined the French coast with submarine pens. Protected by 26 feet of steel-reinforced concrete, as well as batteries of anti-aircraft guns, they were built in anticipation of the arrival of Allied bombers. They have proven quite impregnable. Even 1,000-pound bombs bounce harmlessly off the huge docks. More precise low-level attack is prevented by the anti-aircraft guns, which put up such a thick wall of shells that British pilots have nicknamed Saint-Nazaire Flak City. The The submarines kept here are quite safe, as they are repaired and readied for their next stealthy missions in the waters of the English Channel. Between November and January, the Allied commanders designed a new technique for coordinating high-altitude bombing. Called bombing on leader, the technique involves an extremely tight formation of B-17s releasing their bombs on command of the lead fortress. This tactic, it is hoped, will yield tighter bomb patterns and break the Wolf Pen's defenses. These tight formations, however, make prime targets for the German gunners, who have started aiming not at the planes, but in front of them. The planes of the 8th simply fly into the explosions, sustaining massive damage. By the end of the first bomb-on-leader mission, 7 fortresses are down and over half the remaining bombers damaged. Whether the mission has actually destroyed any German subs remains to be seen. The Allied commanders consider the day's experiment a success. Despite the loss of men and materiel, there is hope that the new technique will be effective and that Allied Atlantic pipelines will remain unbroken in the future. January 1943, Casablanca. U.S. President Franklin Roosevelt and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, along with the top military of both their countries, arrive at the Anfa Hotel in this recently liberated Moroccan city to begin a series of high-level meetings. Also joining the group is General Henri Giraud, Supreme French Commander in North Africa. Conspicuous in his absence, however, is Russian dictator Joseph Stalin, who has declined attendance due to the critical situation at Stalingrad. While the purpose of the conference is to discuss and coordinate both short and long-term plans for the Allied war effort, within a few days it becomes apparent that the British have come not so much to discuss the war effort as to dictate to the Allies what each country's role is to be. The Americans, however, have several problems with the propositions made by the high-handed British, and behind the scenes, heated arguments ensue. The disagreements between the Americans and British lie in a fundamental difference of opinion on how to plot strategy. The English delegation seems intent on charting a far-reaching plan and sticking to it, no matter what eventualities arise, while the U.S. commanders would rather have freedom to adapt to situations as they present themselves. Also, American Admiral Ernest J. King's insistence that at least 30% of the Allied war effort be directed against Japan galls the British commanders. They cannot comprehend that the U.S. will not strictly adhere to the English plan of eliminating Mussolini and Hitler first before dealing with Japan. Meanwhile, news of the meeting is just now reaching Berlin. In December, as the conference was being planned, security in London and Washington, D.C. became increasingly tight. And while the operatives of the German Abwehr, a worldwide network of Nazi spies, could tell from increased activity in both cities that something was happening, Allied intelligence succeeded in concealing its exact nature and whereabouts. However, on 19 January, Walter Schellenberg, head of the Reich Central Security Office, relays information about the conference to Hitler. Ironically, Schellenberg believes that the meeting is in Washington, D.C. because the Spanish Casa Blanca translates as White House. In Morocco, the meetings continue. Then, on 22 January, just as plans are beginning to firm up and English-American relations are beginning to settle down, French General Charles de Gaulle arrives. De Gaulle, who refers to himself as France, feels slighted by FDR and Churchill, who failed to invite him to their conference. Pompous and indignant, he succeeds in disrupting the proceedings and insulting everyone, particularly his countryman Giraud. 10 tension-filled days after their arrival in Casablanca, the Allied leaders depart, having reached an agreement on the future conduct of the war. The plan, while quite similar to the one originally brought to the table by the British, is centered more on preparation and cooperation than on a specific timetable. Everyone involved knows that time will reveal the weaknesses of the Axis, and that only by working in concert can they discover and exploit those weaknesses. Clearly, despite all their differences, the men at Casablanca are in agreement on one fundamental point. The only acceptable end to this war is the unconditional surrender of both Germany and Japan. ubiquitous presence of automobiles on the battlefield is unique to this Second World War. The increase in mobility and speed the auto brought to the civilian world has been a boon to the military as well, providing rapid transport of men and materials alike. But the vehicles have paid a high price for their services. One need only glance around a newly deserted battlefield to see dozens of charred jeeps and trucks, their tires wilted and windshields shattered. This war has required no small sacrifice from the people on the home front. But of all the materials which people must do without, none creates more consternation than rubber. The Japanese invasion of the Asian subcontinent effectively clamped off the source of most of America's rubber. People across the country rushed out to stockpile tires for their own use. This hoarding came to an abrupt end with the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor.
Specifically, we don't know how much used rubber there is in your cellar, your barn, your stockroom, your garage, your attic. The only way to find out is to get the used rubber in where it can stand up and be counted.
The scarcity of rubber has been dealt with on every front. President Roosevelt has appealed in his radio broadcast to the people of the country, asking them to find their spent rubber items from old galoshes and water bottles to worn-out tires and bring them to recycling facilities. There, the rubber is reclaimed and put to use in the war effort. Through special processes which separate good, salvageable material from foreign substances, such as fibers in tire walls, the revitalized rubber can then be fabricated into the tires, belts, and hoses that keep automobiles running. Even as methods have been developed for reclaiming spent rubber, others have been developed for making a new kind of rubber. Scientists have succeeded in formulating a synthetic rubber called government rubber styrene, which is similar to, but superior to, the German Buna rubber. Factories across the country are now dedicated to the manufacture of GRS. The effort to provide automobiles for the battlefront extends into all realms on the home front. Entire cars are recycled, their metal slagged and reformed into new vehicles. People throughout the nation have taken to carpooling to work in order to save gasoline, proudly displaying on their windshields stickers which indicate how much gas they are permitted to buy each week. No one is allowed to drive for pleasure, except members of Congress. The strict rationing of all things car-related seems counter to the great mobility and expansiveness upon which the country is based. But it must be remembered that the beneficiaries of rationing are the nation's boys fighting on foreign soil.
Of one thing you can be sure. We are going to see to it that there's enough rubber to build the planes to bomb Tokyo and Berlin. Enough rubber to build the tanks to crush the enemy wherever we may find him. Enough rubber to win this war.
January 1942, the Russian front. Near the southern tip of Lake Ladoga, the big guns of the Soviet 67th and 2nd Chalk armies begin pounding German positions from the east and the west simultaneously. These are the opening salvos of Operation Spark, the Soviet scheme to break through to the long-besieged city of Leningrad. Despite Russian success, albeit limited, at using the lake as a means of moving food and military supplies into the city, as well as evacuating starving civilians, the Nazis have maintained a stranglehold on the city, the linchpin of which is an 11-mile stretch of land on the southern shore of the lake that has come to be known as the Bottleneck. It is here that the German holdings are thinnest, and it is here that Stalin has chosen to throw the weight of the Russian armed forces into breaking the siege. With the 67th attacking from the west and the 2nd attacking from the east, the plan is simply for the two to drive into opposing sides of the Bottleneck and link up, opening a corridor of land that will connect Leningrad with the rest of the Soviet Union. Attacking across the Neva River, the 67th runs headfirst into a withering shower of shells from well-entrenched Nazi artillery. Still, despite the best efforts of the Germans, as the sun sets on the first day, the Russians have taken the city of Maryino on the eastern bank of the river. From here, the Soviets begin attacking to the north and south, as well as continuing their push to the east. Meanwhile, 5 divisions of the Russian Second Shock Army are facing stiffer resistance as they attack to the west. Driving through peat bogs, their initial assault tears holes in the German defenses. However, their forward advance is thwarted when they encounter fortified positions deeper in Nazi territory. As Operation Spark continues, the Russians enjoy their greatest advances along the shore of Lake Ladoga, which forms the top of the Bottleneck, and by 13 January, 2 German divisions are in danger of being destroyed. By the 15th, they are in full retreat, moving through marshes and bogs to safety in the south. On 19 January, having battled the elements, the terrain, and the Nazis for a week and suffering more than 250,000 casualties in the process, the Russian 67th and 2nd Shock Armies come together just east of the city of Schlüsselburg and, in continuing action, open a corridor 7 miles wide. In the days that follow, the Germans regroup and counterattack. But Soviet troops, while unable to expand the passageway, are able to hold their ground. After 503 days, the blockade of Leningrad is broken. Never in history have a city's inhabitants suffered more and still held steadfast in the face of adversity. Hundreds of thousands have perished. In the first awful winter, with people freezing to death and starving, the toll sometimes climbed as high as 4,000 a day. And despite the breakthrough, their suffering will not end anytime soon. It will be weeks before a railway can be built linking Leningrad with Soviet-held territory, and its construction will have to take place under fire. The city and the narrow corridor are still within range of Nazi artillery. So while there is cause for rejoicing, the celebrations are tempered with the knowledge that while the blockade may be broken, Leningrad is not yet liberated. Elsewhere on the Russian front, another siege is about to come to an end. For nearly 10 days, Soviet troops have been pounding what remains of the German 6th Army at Stalingrad. The 6th, under the command of General Friedrich von Paulus, has been surrounded for 2 months, and despite the efforts of the Luftwaffe to keep them supplied, their situation has grown steadily worse. With diminishing levels of food, medical supplies, and ammunition, von Paulus and his men face an impossible situation. Despite repeated entreaties from von Paulus and his fellow field generals to bring the 6th Army's suffering to an end, Hitler has steadfastly refused to even consider such a move, choosing instead to encourage the Luftwaffe to increase the amount of supplies being flown into the city. Everyone but Hitler realizes this is pure folly. On its best day, the airlift has provided only a small fraction of what is needed to maintain the troops. As the month draws to a close, events begin to speed up. On 22 January, a massive artillery barrage signals the beginning of the final phase of the Red Army assault. On 24 January, permission is again requested for von Paulus to surrender. Hitler refuses. On 25 January, attacking Russian forces meet in the middle of Stalingrad, splitting the 6th Army into 2 pockets. By 29 January, it is clear to all, including Hitler, that the end is near. In a final communique to von Paulus, Hitler instructs him to continue to hold out and promotes him to field marshal. The Nazi leader is certain that, as a field marshal, von Paulus will commit suicide rather than submit to the disgrace of captivity. Von Paulus is not impressed, and the next day he surrenders himself and the men in his section of the city, becoming the first field marshal in German history ever to give himself up to the enemy. This once proud general has seen his once proud army reduced to tatters. His promotion is more insult than accolade. He cannot accept such an honor as legitimate when bestowed by a man who has treated these brave warriors with such disrespect. 2 days later, the remaining group of German soldiers surrenders to the Russians. In and around the city, 147,000 of their brethren lie dead, and along with them, any hope for a Nazi victory over Russia. The battle for Stalingrad is over. January 1943, Libya. After nearly 3 years of fighting, during which the advantage seesawed back and forth between the Axis and the Allies a half-dozen times, British troops enter and occupy the port city of Tripoli, marking the end of the campaign to liberate the western desert region of the Middle East. Rather than just another conquest, it is the crowning achievement of the British Eighth Army and its commander, General Bernard Montgomery. Montgomery's vanquished foe is Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. Since taking command of German and Italian forces here in early 1941, Rommel had time and again overcome inconsistent or non-existent supply lines, the numerical superiority of his enemy, and the military ineptitude of his commanders to hold the British at bay. However, the last 2 months have consisted of little more than the English army pursuing a German army in full retreat. After their victory at El Alamein, Montgomery and the 8th pursued Rommel's troops across the desert from city to city. Although pressured by Allied commanders to accelerate his movements so that he might catch and crush the Germans, Montgomery, hampered by minefields and weather, set and maintained a deliberate pace. A grateful Rommel withdrew rapidly, hoping to regroup and set some sort of defense. He was never to get the chance. The British, only occasionally making contact with Nazi rearguard units, practically strolled through cities for which they had previously paid in blood. Mersa Matruh was unoccupied. Sidi Barrani, Halfaya Pass, and Bardia were taken without opposition. Tobruk and Benghazi were practically deserted. Suddenly, on 23 November, the Germans put up an unexpectedly spirited defense at Agadir. Although the Nazis were ultimately forced to retreat to El Aghilah, Montgomery, having pursued the enemy nearly 600 miles in 2 weeks, decided to halt his advance and regroup. By 11 December, the 8th once again began to move. While Rommel had been able to do little to resupply and reinforce his depleted forces, the respite had allowed his troops the chance to dig in, and they were able to mount a defense of the city. Nevertheless, by the 14th, the British were turning the screws, and he was forced to pull out of El Aghilah. Now it is all over. For over a month, the Germans have been able to muster little more than a fighting withdrawal, and Rommel has pulled all of his troops into Tunisia for what he believes will be a last stand. On 23 January, a triumphant British Eighth Army moves into Tripoli. For most of these soldiers, the stay will be brief. Despite his propensity for slow, methodical advance, Montgomery is pushing his men to move quickly. He knows that Rommel, having retreated to Tunisia, will now face mounting pressure from both the English and the Americans, and that it is only a matter of time before the Desert Fox and his men are driven across the Mediterranean and out of Africa for good. In the years since the outbreak of war in the Pacific, the Japanese have earned a reputation as almost superhuman fighting men. In their sudden southward swoop, the Japanese army seemed almost invincible. Japanese soldiers willingly, even enthusiastically, sacrificed themselves for the larger cause of victory, refusing to give up no matter how outnumbered. In Hong Kong, Singapore, Indochina, down the China coast, in the rocky crags of Corregidor, the Japanese seem invincible. Even on Guadalcanal, ultimately a defeat for the Empire, Japanese infantry has achieved almost mythic status in the minds of American Marines. But in Japan itself, there is a dawning understanding that the reality of the Japanese fighting man falls considerably short of Allied impressions. In late 1942, Prime Minister Hideki Tojo, himself a lifelong military man, confides that he does not believe it will be possible to further expand the Japanese Empire. The reasons for this pessimism are many, but none is so glaringly obvious to Rising Sun military professionals as the decreasing capabilities of the Japanese army. Once an elite corps that traced its heritage to the samurai, after 3 consecutive years of doubling in size, it is now overflowing with ill-trained conscripts. One need look no further than Manchuria to understand what is keeping the Japanese leadership awake at night. Manchuria is important to the Japanese largely because it borders the southwestern tip of the Soviet Union. It has long been Japan's ambition to control what is now Soviet Asia, and the key to that dominance lies in Vladivostok, a port city only 2 days' march from the Chinese border. When the Japanese entered into the tripartite pact with the Germans and Italians, it was largely because they thought it would help them conquer Vladivostok. Japan assumed that when Hitler invaded Russia, Stalin would loot the defenses around Vladivostok to protect Moscow. When that happened, the Japanese knew they could waltz into Soviet territory without a battle. In a sense, all Japanese activity in northern China was prelude to the planned invasion of the Soviet Union. Japanese commanders charged with subduing China complained vociferously that the troops they were being sent were poorly trained and undisciplined, a charge no one back in Tokyo even bothered to deny. The crack troops, everyone knew, were being held back for the push north to Vladivostok. That push, though a primary goal of Japanese expansion, has never come. Well aware of the Japanese threat, Stalin has left his East Asian army largely intact. Though the situation in Europe is at times dire, Stalin knows that if the Nazis were to prevail, his only hope for reinforcement would be to bring materiel from the United States through Vladivostok. Stalemated to the north, but nonetheless ambitious, the Japanese decided to push south instead. As a result, the crack troops that had been held back for war with the Soviets are now spread down the coast of Asia, around the Philippine archipelago, and across hundreds of islands in the Pacific Ocean. The Japanese army that remains in Manchuria is badly equipped and bored almost out of its mind. Thousands of new conscripts flood into the area, showing how desperate the Japanese really are. They are largely men passed over in previous call-ups, the unhealthy, the infirm, the overage. Even ethnic Japanese in captured areas are pressed into service, though most have never lived in Japan, and some can't even understand the orders of their superior officers. As Tojo and his advisors look out across the empire, they cannot help but feel slightly bewildered. As the rest of the world continues to gear up for war against a race of supermen, the Japanese army, still outwardly appearing nearly invincible, is from the inside obviously a hollow shell. War, by its very nature, inflicts on those involved, both directly and indirectly, a great deal of suffering and destruction. However, while no one wishes to dismiss or rationalize the negative impact of war, it has also been the catalyst for great advancements in technology. The planes pouring off assembly lines are bigger, faster, and more maneuverable than would have been thought possible a few short years ago. New weapon systems have been developed that are capable of propelling explosives over great distances, and physicists, tucked away in their laboratories, are attempting to unleash the power of the atom. Another technology that has come of age as a result of efforts to gain advantage over the enemy is radar. Radar, the name is an acronym for radio detection and ranging, allows the user, through the transmission of radio waves, to detect the presence of and measure the distance to objects both near and far. Through cooperation between Britain and the United States, it has been developed and incorporated into systems that have radically changed the way this war is being fought. The first practical radar system was developed by the British in 1935, and none too soon. It was critical in their ability to stop the onslaught by Hermann Göring's Luftwaffe at the height of the Blitz. The heart of British radar operations is the filter room at Fighter Command Headquarters. Here, the British can see the German air fleets forming over the continent and dispatch the appropriate number of fighters to intercept them. Although they understood the technical aspects of radar, the Germans were slow to grasp the enormous tactical advantage it gave the British. The destruction of a radar site on the Isle of Wight in August 1940 left a 10-mile gap in the British defenses that would have permitted the Luftwaffe to attack the vital port of Southampton unmolested. Yet the Germans failed to take advantage of the opportunity. And, in what hindsight must certainly reveal to be a monumental error, Göring ordered his bombers to stop targeting radar sites altogether, explaining that they required too much effort to justify such a little result. Now, however, the shoe is on the other foot, as the Germans are using radar to detect Allied bombers on their way across the Channel. As soon as they show up on the radar screens, the information is immediately relayed to interceptor fighter squadrons and flak batteries who coordinate their fire based on the aircraft's exact position. The effectiveness of this technique is demonstrated in the heavy losses sustained by the Allied bomber formations. In the Pacific, the United States is also reaping the benefits of radar-controlled systems. Naval anti-aircraft fire is inflicting heavy losses on attacking Japanese planes and depleting Japan's reserve of highly trained pilots. With greener, less experienced pilots filling the vacancies, the vaunted Japanese Air Force is becoming increasingly vulnerable. Continued research by the United States and Britain has refined and improved the technology. For example, radar systems that use shorter radio wavelengths give a much more accurate picture of the target and can be housed in a much smaller case, allowing it to be installed in aircraft. So, just as radar helped save Britain during the Blitz, it is now helping to battle the threat posed by the German wolf packs, who are wreaking havoc with Allied shipping, threatening to cut the vital lifeline between Britain and the United States. The hunters have become the hunted, as German submarines who must surface to recharge their batteries are becoming easy targets for radar-equipped Allied bombers. German subcommanders, who before could roam the seas with impunity, now anxiously search the skies, looking for the distant bomber that might spell their doom. While the blunt force weapons employed in this war are crucial to success, the ability to effectively bring those weapons to bear is equally important. In the end, victory may well come down to the ability to exploit small advantages, even those as small as a radio wave. (27 January 1943, Guadalcanal. For the past month, the men of the U.S. 14th Corps under the command of Major General Alexander Patch have slowly been rooting the Japanese defenders out of their entrenched positions and driving them toward Cape Esperance on the northwest tip of the island. The resistance is so tenacious that the Americans do not realize that what they are facing is just a rear guard. In fact, the Japanese are preparing to withdraw from the island. Fearing the Japanese troops will be reinforced at Cape Esperance and drive down the west coast of the island, General Patch lands elements of the Americal Division at Nuga Point 8 miles south of the Cape, to serve as a blocking force. With Patch's forces advancing toward them on both coasts, the Japanese step up their air attacks, hoping to slow the Americans long enough to evacuate their troops. In the north, they have fallen back to their final line of defense, Bonagi River, a mere 15 miles from their evacuation point. Here, their resistance stiffens and the American drive slows. In the south, the Americans advance cautiously. Aware of increased Japanese naval activity in the area, U.S. commanders suspect that the enemy may be preparing to mount a new offensive, and fear a rapid advance may lead them into an enemy trap. Their caution opens a window of opportunity for the Japanese. On 1st February, they successfully evacuate 5,000 troops to destroyers waiting offshore. The evacuations continue as the Americans slowly close in on the Japanese positions, unaware the enemy is slipping away under their noses. On 8 February, with American shells falling around them, the last Japanese soldiers are ferried from the island. In a 1-week period, the Japanese have managed to evacuate over 10,000 troops without the Americans catching on. The Americans have handed the Japanese Army and Navy a major defeat. The Rising Sun has lost some 25,000 troops. Its ranks of well-trained pilots have been decimated, and its Navy has lost its dominance of the seas. Although the enemy has managed to escape their grasp, it does little to temper the excitement of U.S. troops. However, their elation is mitigated by the great cost of the victory. Over 1,500 Americans have died and 4,300 have been wounded. Still, having begun the battle at a distinct disadvantage, they have defeated a well-trained, well-equipped, and extremely determined enemy, and in the process, they have become a seasoned fighting force with the confidence and resolve to carry the fight all the way to Japan. Although there are certainly long, bloody struggles yet to be waged, Guadalcanal seems to mark a major turning point in the war in the Pacific. 8 February 1943, Impel, India. A motley group of British, Gurkha, and Burmese soldiers set off on what their leader has described to them as a great adventure. While there are certainly no rules governing when and where war can be taken to the enemy, there are generally accepted lines that mark what is considered the front. These men, known as the Chindits, are about to cross those lines and strike at the enemy where he least expects it. Led by the eccentric Indian-born Colonel Lord Wingate, the Chindits cross into Burma to fight as a guerrilla force, disrupt Japanese supply routes, and strike targets of opportunity. Although they have trained for months, the operation was almost canceled at the last moment by British commanders. Initially, it was intended as a precursor to a massed British strike into Burma. With the cancellation of those plans, British commanders informed Wingate that his part in it was also canceled. Wingate, however, successfully argued that the guerrilla tactics he had developed could still be useful in disrupting Japanese operations, and was given permission to proceed. Wingate knows that this is an unorthodox style of warfare, and therefore he adopts an unorthodox style of command. Standard military protocol is abandoned. The men grow beards, their uniforms grow shabby, and saluting is left to those fighting on their own side of the enemy's lines. This failure to observe traditional military regulations does not mean there is a lack of discipline. Wingate places tremendous demands on his men. Their very survival means staying one step ahead of the Japanese, and they are therefore compelled to keep moving even when physically exhausted. Although they are relatively few in number, the Chindits are causing the Japanese real headaches. The thick Burmese jungle restricts Japanese supply operations to a few vital routes which are vulnerable to attack, a weakness Wingate is quick to exploit. Vital bridges on the Mandalay-Myitkyina Railroad are destroyed, causing a major disruption in the movement of supplies and troops to the front. After striking the enemy, the Chindits quickly retreat to the dense Burmese jungle that offers them protection from the ever-present Japanese scout planes. They move as long as daylight permits, putting as much distance as possible between them and their Japanese pursuers. Isolated and alone, Wingate and his men are totally dependent on airdrops for supplies. C-47s deliver ammunition, K-rations, medicine, and anything else they need to fight and survive in the treacherous jungles of Burma. The men quickly retrieve and distribute the supplies and are on the move again. Fighting this type of war requires a special breed of man. They must be resourceful, bold, and resilient. With each success, they not only disrupt enemy operations, they deny him a sense of security that he would normally enjoy this far behind his own lines. For the Japanese, the Chindits are becoming increasingly troublesome. Beyond the logistical problems created by the destruction of key bridges and roads, morale in the theater is beginning to suffer. The soldiers of the Imperial Army, used to fighting a conventional war, are now faced with an elusive enemy that strikes when least expected with devastating results, and then disappears. Wingate is elated. His confidence in his men and in his tactics has been vindicated. His operation, which was almost canceled, has met with astounding success. It has been, in many ways, the most effective campaign yet waged by the Allies in Burma. February 1943, Tunisia, with Americans threatening to launch a drive which could divide the Axis forces in Africa, recently arrived Colonel General Jürgen von Arnim launches an armored assault on Allied positions near Sidi Bouzid. Codenamed Frühlingswind, or Spring Wind, the offensive catches the inexperienced American forces off guard. They prove easy pickings for the new 63-ton Tiger tanks and, having taken heavy losses, are forced to retreat. The following day, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel launches an assault to the west on the town of Gafsa, only recently occupied by the Allies. The attack succeeds in driving out the American and French troops. With British units providing covering fire, they fall back 40 miles to the city of Feriana, near Kasserine Pass. Meanwhile, the Allies have launched a counterattack to halt the German advance. During the night, however, the Germans move up and surround the Allied positions. In the ensuing battle, just over 200 of the Americans manage to break through the German lines. Most of the rest are taken prisoner. By the morning of the 16th, it is clear the attack has failed. As a result, the Axis assault on the Allied line continues, and by 18 February, Rommel and his Africa Corps are at the foot of Kasserine Pass. The road through the pass is defended by a hodgepodge of Allied troops, composed largely of American combat engineers with virtually no experience in battle. The full attack comes on the morning of 19 February. With mines slowing the enemy, and emboldened by the arrival of reinforcements, the Green Americans somehow hold their positions against Rommel's battle-hardened troops. By evening, the Germans are no longer attempting to advance, opting instead to bombard the Allied positions with their artillery. Finally, on the afternoon of 20 February, Nazi forces break through Kasserine Pass and continue their offensive. Rommel believes that the Axis should drive toward the Algerian city of Tebessa. However, the Italian High Command insists he press on to Le Caf. Scouts report that along the road between Kasserine and Le Caf, outside the town of Tala, Allied defenses are almost non-existent. Rommel mistakenly believes that they have concentrated their forces inside Tala and are preparing to attack. In response, he slows his advance. This pause gives the Allies, who are actually regrouping in Le Caf, an opportunity to move up and occupy the road to Tala. As the Germans and Italians begin their advance towards Tala on 22 February, they immediately fall under withering Allied fire. The massive bombardment causes Major General Fritz von Bragg to halt his advance and report to Rommel that a major Allied counteroffensive lies ahead. Bragg waits through the day for the onset of the offensive, but only a few British tanks come forward. Somehow, this convinces Bragg and Rommel of the seriousness of the Allied counteroffensive. Rommel calls off the assault. By 24 February, a disheartened Rommel and his tanks are en route back to the Mareth line. The Allies quickly re-establish themselves at Kasserine Pass. Though both the Allies and Axis have suffered huge losses, in terms of occupied territory, it is as if the past week never happened. Both sides are discouraged. The Americans are disgusted by the poor preparation and judgment shown at Kasserine, and have begun their search for a more decisive path to the end of the war in North Africa. For Erwin Rommel, the effects of this offensive are even more profound. After seeing how well supplied and supported his new American prisoners are in comparison to his own troops, he is coming to understand the scope of the U.S. war effort, and has begun to doubt the ability of the Axis to win in Africa. February 1943, the Russian front. After months of retreat and defensive action, German guns once again flash with offensive fire as Nazi troops under the command of Field Marshal Erich von Manstein returned to the role of aggressors. Since the beginning of the Stalingrad counteroffensive in November, Hitler's armies have by and large seen only defeat at the hands of their Russian adversaries. But now the tanks of the 1st and 4th Panzer Armies and the 2nd SS Panzer Corps begin pounding an unprepared and unsuspecting Red Army. Just days prior to the attack, an angry Adolf Hitler had come to von Manstein's headquarters at the town of Zaporozhye on the Dnieper River, with every intention of relieving him of duty. But the Field Marshal was ready with a plan that he was sure the Fuhrer would find appealing. In a scheme that mirrors Stalin's triumph at Stalingrad, von Manstein has withheld men and supplies from the fray, intentionally allowing the Russians to advance so rapidly that they have stretched their supply lines and exhausted their men. This quick push has created a salient and inward bulge in the front lines. It is von Manstein's intention to send his armor north and south across the base of this bulge, cutting it off and trapping the advancing Russians. Hitler was more than pleased with the plan as presented. Having approved the plan, Hitler flew out of the airport at Zaporozhye, leaving a relieved von Manstein behind. The Field Marshal's relief stemmed not just from having avoided dismissal, but from the fact that while the Nazi leader was present, lead tanks of the Russian advance had drawn within 6 miles of his headquarters. Now, with the battle underway and the Nazi tanks advancing, it is quickly becoming clear that the strategy that worked so well for Stalin and Zhukov at Stalingrad is fated to work equally well for Hitler and von Manstein. German infantry and armor, aided by Luftwaffe Stukas, tear through weary Red Army lines. Before long, those pushing to the south have ripped a 25-mile hole in the Russian defenses and are racing forward. The Wehrmacht and SS forces continue their advances through the next day, cutting rail links and supply lines as they go. By the evening of 22 February, the two forces have linked up and German commanders are able to report to von Manstein that the trap has been sprung. The Russians in the salient are surrounded. Von Manstein in turn reports to Hitler that the plan has succeeded. The Nazi leader is ecstatic. Not only have the Nazis won their first victory since the Russians surrounded and crushed the German Sixth Army at Stalingrad, they have done so using Stalin's own strategy.
There is perhaps no greater spur to the development of new technology than war. In the desperation of battle, ideas that would be dismissed in less trying times as impractical or even impossible are tried and found to have merit. Certainly, one of the enduring legacies of World War II will be its contribution to engineering. Aircraft are being developed that in the post-war world will change the way mankind travels. Means of communication are being researched that will shrink the globe into what will be, in effect, a single village. And on the almost forgotten front in South Asia, where the Allies labor in jungles of obscurity, necessity has indeed become the mother of invention. There, the war is being fought over logistics. The Allies want to open the roads to resupply the Chinese. The Japanese seek to keep the roads closed. To keep those roads open, the Allies have recently unveiled a secret weapon of gargantuan proportions. A construction machine that would impress even the most seasoned jungle engineer, and a transportation system as endearing to the Burmese jungle fighters as the common jeep is to GIs in the muddy fields of Europe. The secret weapon? The elephant. Not sleek to look at, perhaps, but efficient in its own way. Weighing in at around 10 tons, the elephant runs not on gasoline, but on indigenous fuels. Grass, trees, vines to be found alongside construction sites. Back at the garage, elephants require little maintenance. A pat on the back, a handful of peanuts, an occasional spray down with fresh water. They move well through all terrains, uphill and down, as ably through deep mud as through choking dust. Elephants ford rivers effortlessly, even joyfully. Elephants are cost-effective as well. They fend for themselves at night, and the standard model comes equipped with a front-mounted crane to help with the heavy lifting. Soldiers working the Burma Road use elephants for moving the 2-ton logs that form the foundations for bridges, for knocking down pesky trees that block their path, and even for helping less advanced equipment that falls prey to weather or geography. The development of the elephant is a technological coup, to be sure. Allied intelligence reports that the Japanese, so proud of their own industrial prowess, have yet to unveil a pachyderm capability of their own. Certainly, this advantage bodes well for the end of the war and makes one wonder, what will they think of next?
One March 1943, the Bismarck Sea, a Japanese convoy consisting of 8 Army transports and 8 destroyers sails for New Guinea. Aboard are almost 7,000 troops of the newly created Japanese 18th Army, being sent to reinforce the garrison at Lae. When it became evident to Japanese commanders they would have to cede Guadalcanal to the Americans, they decided to focus their attention on strengthening the rest of their bases in the Southwest Pacific, in hopes of stopping a further westward drive by the Allies. On the afternoon of the 2nd, after rounding Cape Gloucester, the convoy comes under attack from American heavy bombers. Before the attack is over, 1 transport is sunk and 2 others are damaged. Though the Japanese breathe a sigh of relief, in fact, their troubles have just begun. On 3 March, unsatisfied with their tally the day before, commanders of the American 5th Air Force launch a second strike on the Japanese convoy. Medium and heavy bombers with fighter escorts tear into the Japanese ships. Flying at wave-top level, they deliver their loads with devastating accuracy. Of 37 bombs dropped, 28 find their mark. The convoy is virtually wiped out. All 8 of the transports are sent to the bottom, along with 4 of their destroyer escorts. Japanese commanders are more and more frustrated. Sustaining their armies scattered around the Pacific is becoming increasingly difficult. The debacle in the Bismarck Sea is but the latest in a series of American successes against Japanese shipping. After learning some tough lessons at the hands of the German wolf packs, American naval commanders recognized the essential Japanese vulnerability. Submarines working in Pacific sea lanes could cut supply lines to isolated Pacific islands. American submarine construction increased dramatically, and the result of that is beginning to be seen. Now, Japanese convoys not only must avoid American bombers close to their destination, but face the menace of American wolf packs lurking beneath Japan's home waters. In 1942, American subs sank 180 Japanese ships. Their success in the first 2 months of 1943 has American naval commanders almost giddy with excitement. If the current pace continues, twice as much Japanese shipping will be sunk this year as last. Despite being ravaged by the American U-boats, Japanese commanders have failed to utilize their own fleet of submarines. Instead of using them to cut the Americans' overstretched and vulnerable supply routes, they have employed them instead as a tool of diplomacy. Beginning in August 1942, Japanese submarines traveled 15,000 miles to the German U-boat base at Lorient, France, to deliver tons of zinc, tin, tungsten, and other raw materials to the Germans. Duly impressed with the feat, Hitler and Admiral Karl Dönitz, in turn, gave the Japanese plans for new types of artillery, aircraft engines, and, ironically, better submarines. Unfortunately for the Japanese, all of these subs are sent to a watery grave on their trip home. Ultimately, this war will be decided not so much by which side has the most or best equipment, but by which side can deliver it to the front. If Japanese convoys continue to be ravaged by American bombers and submarines, while U.S. supply lines go unmolested, Japanese garrisons throughout the Pacific will, quite simply, wither on the vine. March 1943, the English Channel. Almost a year to the day since its first mission against Essen, the Royal Air Force sends into the morning air 443 bombers to strike the German industrial center. Leading the way are fighters that have been outfitted with the RAF's new Oboe radar precision bombing system. Some of the Halifax bombers are now carrying the H-2S centimetric radar. The British believe that these two systems will yield a vast improvement in accuracy over last year's disappointing performance in the pollution-shrouded Ruhr Valley. Since the RAF's last raid, Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments and Munitions, has raised German ammunition production over 100% and tank and gun production by over 25% each. He has done this by the brutal application of slave labor, particularly in and around Essen. The first target of what is to be an aggressive campaign in the Ruhr Valley, Essen has been chosen by the Bomber Command not only for its high productivity, but for the great variety of goods made there. The successful destruction of Essen should disrupt almost every area of production. Tank hulls, anti-aircraft guns, howitzers, and millions of tons of ammunition annually pour out of the huge Essen manufacturing complex owned by the Krupp family. The Mosquito fighters, guided by the new Oboe radar system, drop yellow flares to mark a path for the bombers. The Halifaxes follow, using their more accurate H-2S ground scanning radar to mark bombing areas with green and red flares, while simultaneously dropping incendiary bombs. This new technique, with its devotion to precision, is essential if the bombardiers are to be effective in the Ruhr, where vision is so obscured by coal dust and smoke that the pilots of the RAF call it black country. The Bomber Command hopes that the bombs will fall squarely in the center of the Krupp's 2-square-mile main manufacturing facility and will spare the housing provided for the enslaved workers. In a span of 40 minutes, the British bombers succeed on an unprecedented level. Those targets not hit directly by high explosive bombs are engulfed in secondary explosions and flames. 53 buildings are disabled, as well as Essen's power plant and several of the Krupp's coal mines. Due to insufficient anti-aircraft guns and the inferior radar of the German night flyers, only 14 British planes are downed. While the RAF has enjoyed a victory at Essen, it should be noted that there are many such manufacturing towns scattered across German territories. As a result, damage in Essen is a relatively minor setback for the Nazi war machine. The true value of the bombing of Essen can perhaps be found in the promise shown by the new techniques and the growing experience of the British flyers. Both offer hope that someday Hitler's factories might be shut down altogether. February 1943, poised for a drive deep into Allied territory after his victory at Kasserine Pass, a depressed and exhausted Field Marshal Erwin Rommel instead turns and retreats to German defenses at the Mareth Line. The move is totally out of character for Rommel, who literally wrote the book on aggressive tank tactics. But the Field Marshal, a professional soldier in an army increasingly dominated by Nazi political hacks, seems on the verge of resigning himself to the fact that the Axis cause in North Africa is doomed. Rommel knows that all wars are wars of attrition, and that the Allies are able to deliver more troops and supplies than the Axis to North Africa. He can see as well that there is little cooperation even among German officers. And in the Italians, he sees not so much an ally as another enemy. The Italian command is in fact openly lobbying for Rommel's removal. They blame the Field Marshal rather than a shortage of men and supplies for the loss of Libya, Mussolini's most important colony. As if to emphasize the disarray on the Axis side of the front, on 26 February, the German 10th and 15th Panzer Armies, under the command of Rommel's rival, General Oberst Jürgen von Arnim, begin Operation Bull's Head. Conceived and executed without Rommel's knowledge, it is a bold tank thrust west toward the town of Béjac. Von Arnim overtakes an Allied radar station and breaks through British lines before being driven back. The attack is expensive for the Germans. 15 of 19 new Tiger tanks assigned to von Arnim's forces are destroyed. As Rommel contemplates his next move, on the other side of the front, the Allies are making moves of their own. Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower, appalled at the American loss at Kasserine, decides on 4 March to install a new commander of the American Second Corps, General George S. Patton. A brash student of armor tactics, Patton has studied Rommel and dreamed of the day when he would face the Desert Fox in combat. On 6 February, as Patton is arriving at his new command, Rommel is mounting an assault on the town of Medellin. It is, he knows, a move more of desperation than strength. Stored in Medellin are thousands of tons of supplies, guns, ammunition, fuel, food, everything that it takes to support an army. Everything the Allies are able to deliver, and the Axis is not. As his forces confront the British, Rommel knows that if the Afrika Korps fails to take Medellin and the Allied stockpiles there, North Africa is unquestionably lost. As the German tanks press forward, British soldiers manning what are apparently forward anti-tank batteries flee from their positions. The Germans, like thirsty men running toward an oasis, hurtle forward. Barely 60 yards past the anti-tank batteries, British artillery springs its trap. Shell after shell drops down on the badly exposed and helpless Nazi tank columns. By the end of the day, 50 panzers are burning on the battlefield. Rommel has been thwarted. On 9 March, as Patton feverishly whips his troops into shape for a showdown with Rommel, the Desert Fox slips silently from North Africa. Without addressing his troops, without fanfare of any kind, Rommel is gone. Patton, upon receiving word of Rommel's departure, is incensed. A great believer in destiny, he was convinced that he and Rommel would face off. Now he knows it is likely never to be. Far from thwarting destiny, Rommel's departure seems in a way to have fulfilled it. For in 2 changes of command, one Allied and one Axis, the chemistry of the war has changed. The boldest of the German tank commanders has left, defeated and distraught. On the other side of the lines, the most aggressive of the Allied tankers has arrived, his polished helmet gleaming, his ivory-handled revolver strapped to his hips. With this new sheriff in town, one can hardly help but think that the fate of fascism in North Africa has finally, completely, been sealed. When Hitler and the Nazi High Command launched Operation Barbarossa in June 1941, the Russian Air Force was high on its list of targets. Although an enormous force, the Russian pilots were flying outdated machines that stood little chance against the state-of-the-art fighters employed by the Luftwaffe. Within a week of the invasion, 60% of the Red Air Force was destroyed, much of it without ever having left the ground. In the weeks following, as the Wehrmacht drew ever closer to Moscow, vital aircraft factories in the city were forced to shut down and move east to Siberia. With large numbers of their planes destroyed and their ability to replace them severely hampered, the Russians could do little to challenge the Luftwaffe's dominance in the skies. Day and night, the Russian people were subjected to ruthless attacks by fleets of German bombers flying unchallenged over their homes. Frustrated by their impotence, the Soviets developed a special hatred for the pilots of the Luftwaffe and yearned for the day they could strike back. Now, they are getting their chance. The Red Army's success in crushing the German Sixth Army in Stalingrad was in large part due to a resurgence of the Red Air Force. Flying planes fresh from the newly reassembled factories in Siberia, the Russians were able to keep the Luftwaffe off the backs of their ground troops, allowing them to effectively reinforce their positions. More important, they could directly attack the enemy's supply lines, leaving German troops to wither on the vine. Ground attack aircraft have allowed the Russians to blunt the German armor strikes that were so quick and deadly in the early days of the campaign. German tankers are, for the first time, facing a deadly menace in the skies. This new aerial equality is a welcome change for the Russian people. They are finally getting their revenge against the hated Luftwaffe. Downed German planes are sources of great curiosity. Souvenir hunters pick through the wreckage for a piece of the victory. Morale in what had been a broken Russian Air Force now soars. Russian pilots revel in their new status as the protectors of Mother Russia. While downing any German plane is a source of great pride, victories over certain Luftwaffe pilots are particularly honorable. The greatest trophy for a Russian pilot is an Iron Cross from a vanquished foe. As the struggle continues in Russia, the Red Air Force is certain to play a crucial role. And while the Luftwaffe is still a force to be reckoned with, it is, for the first time in this campaign, facing a formidable adversary. The Soviet pilots have earned a special place in the hearts of the Russian citizens, for they know that if they are to drive the Germans from their land, they must first drive them from their skies. Although the American military was caught grossly unprepared for the onset of war, its commanders have been quick to learn from their mistakes. Beyond correcting the obvious deficiencies in both the quality and quantity of equipment, great strides have been made in preparing the men themselves for the challenges they will face. Despite the victory on Guadalcanal, the American forces fighting there were severely bloodied by an enemy who was far more savvy about how to fight and survive in the jungle. On New Guinea and in Burma, American men also find themselves living and fighting in an environment for which they are wholly unprepared. Realizing that driving across the Pacific will mean wresting many more jungle islands from Japanese control, American commanders have established schools to train their men in the ways of jungle warfare. Sites in Burma, as well as the hard-won jungles of Guadalcanal, are now serving as training grounds. The men are taught how to advance quietly through the jungle, ever alert for an enemy ambush. They receive one-on-one personal training as well as unit training. For most, it is the first time they have been exposed to the harsh jungle environment, and the instructors do everything possible to simulate combat situations. Roman candles are a favorite method to simulate hot-flying shrapnel. Beyond training and techniques for fighting in the jungle, the men are taught the do's and don'ts of living in the jungle. With instruction from veteran Australian troops as well as Burmese natives, the men learn how to distinguish edible fruits and vegetables from poisonous ones. They are introduced to what is surely the most versatile plant on Earth, the bamboo. It can be used for everything from constructing a lean-to shelter, to a raft, to a cooking pot for dinner. Palm fronds can be thatched together to make a mattress or hat. Perhaps the most important lesson the men will learn is the importance of water safety. Diseases contracted from drinking tainted water have severely sapped the fighting strength of many American units fighting in the jungle. Here they learn that the only safe drinking water in the jungle comes from vines and trees. Water from any other source must first be boiled. Although the drive across the Pacific will certainly be a long, bloody affair, American commanders hope that the increase in training and knowledge will help save lives and assure that American boys are the best equipped and best trained fighting men in the world. 16 March 1943, reeling from American attacks, Italians defending the Libyan town of Gafsa begin falling back toward El Guitar. They are being pressed by the American Second Corps, commanded by General George S. Patton. Patton is newly arrived in North Africa and absolutely convinced that it is his historic destiny to drive the Italians and their German allies back to the Reichstag. That is not an opinion shared by Patton's boss, British Field Marshal Sir Harold Alexander. The Second Corps had, before the arrival of Patton, earned a reputation as a sloppy, disorganized outfit. Alexander does not believe that even Patton could substantially change that in less than the 1 month he has been in charge. Patton, of course, believes otherwise. He has for a month inflicted his regimen of discipline and hard work on the Corps, but the new and improved Second remains untested. Though Patton would prefer to pursue the Italians, Alexander has larger concerns. With a light armored unit moving against the airport at Metsuona, Alexander decides Patton could serve best by staying put, in effect protecting the British flank. Patton is furious. He believes that the British are conspiring against him, that they are holding him back to protect for themselves the hero's limelight. So, in open defiance of his superiors, he orders the 1st Armored Division to keep moving, to push toward the town of McNassie. The British are irritated, but can do nothing to stop him, since Patton befogs the issue, pleading miscommunication and claiming that he is merely reacting to German movements. By 22 March, the 1st is in McNassie, and is met there by elements of the German 10th Panzer Division. The thrust quickly bogs down as neither side is able to win a decisive advantage. As the 1st Armored Division has been pushing forward, so has the 1st Infantry. The Big Red One fights its way up the Gafsa-Gabas Road toward El Guitar. On 23 March, the Germans mount a brutal counterattack. Units of the 10th Panzer sweep 50 heavy tanks against a force of American Shermans and half-track tank destroyers. The Germans take heavy losses, but the Americans are forced back. Short, as always, of logistical support, the Germans are forced to break off the attack to refuel and reinforce. During that lull, word filters back to the Allies of a plan for a new assault. It comes later that afternoon, and the Americans are ready for it. The panzers and the infantry accompanying them are greeted with a ruinous artillery barrage. Armor-piercing shells rain down on the tanks, and anti-personnel rounds explode above the troops, showering them with white-hot shrapnel. The Nazis that are not dead or wounded retreat. It is, Patton points out, the first time Americans have faced German tanks on prime tank ground and won. Patton cannot resist looking forward. His gaze shifts from El Guitar to the next town along the road, Gabas. He orders the 1st and 9th Infantry Divisions into the hills around El Guitar to dislodge the enemy from their fortifications in preparation for a move, but finds the Germans heavily dug in. Progress is nearly non-existent. The British, still driving into their section of the front, are also meeting stiff resistance. In a dry riverbed 110 miles from Gafsa, the Germans leave behind deep anti-tank trenches, minefields, and all kinds of booby traps. Then they take to the hills. There they await the British decision to move forward, across the riverbed under a well-directed artillery barrage, or try to find some alternative. April 1943, Rabaul, New Britain. 180 Japanese planes take off, heading towards Guadalcanal in an attempt to hinder the Allied drive westward. This assault, called Operation X, is the first phase of the Imperial Navy's two-stage plan, I Go. Under direction of the Commander-in-Chief of the Japanese Navy, Isoroku Yamamoto, the plan calls for an initial strike against the Americans in the Solomons, followed shortly thereafter by a raid against Allied positions in New Guinea called Operation Y. Alerted to the impending Japanese action, the Americans have a host of Wildcats, Lightnings, and Corsairs waiting to intercept the approaching force. The American pilots receive assistance from the anti-aircraft guns on the ships below, and together they succeed in driving most of the Japanese away without taking substantial damage. At the end of the day, only 3 Allied ships have slipped to the floor of Iron Bottom Sound. Displeased by the failure of Operation X, Admiral Yamamoto nonetheless orders that preparations for Operation Y continue and plans a morale-boosting trip to inspect his frontline soldiers. His concern for his men does not go unnoticed by the Allies, however, as his itinerary is intercepted and forwarded to Admiral Chester Nimitz, who realizes the intercept could prove a mixed blessing. While the Allies would like very much to use the information to assassinate Yamamoto, doing so could reveal their knowledge of the Japanese code. It takes orders from the President himself to resolve the issue. Roosevelt orders that the mission to kill the man who planned Pearl Harbor be given top priority. On 17 April, orders arrive at Henderson Field from Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox, instructing Major John Mitchell to lead a force of 18 P-38 Lightnings on a mission the next morning to reach and destroy the Betty bomber carrying General Yamamoto to Bougainville. The following morning, as the Japanese planes approached the Bougainville airfield, the Lightnings attack. While most focus their efforts on the Zero escort planes, two focus entirely on destroying the bombers. They succeed in downing the Betty carrying Yamamoto's chief of staff, General Ugaki, who survives the crash, and shortly thereafter destroy Yamamoto's, killing everyone on board. This delicate operation proves perfectly executed, as word spreads around the world of how American coast watchers spotted the planes and were responsible for the attack. While Allied knowledge of the Japanese code remains secret, U.S. commanders are still left with the unlikely possibility that Yamamoto's successor will be just as capable. And they wonder how much the death of just one man can turn the tide of a war. April 1943, England. Huge formations of Royal Air Force bombers take to the air and begin crossing the English Channel. Their target? The town of Essen in Germany's Ruhr Valley. This mission, one of many intended to devastate the Ruhr, the key industrial center of the Nazi war machine, is part of an ongoing air offensive designed to strike at the heart of Hitler's military might. Essen, the chief city of the Ruhr, is home to the Krupp's armament plants, as well as a large segment of Germany's steel-making industry. So, once again, it is here that the British bombers begin dropping their payloads. The bomber crews call the Ruhr Happy Valley, but their task is anything but joyous. Despite the short distance to the target, this is no milk run. Essen is the most heavily defended city in the region. In an attempt to obliterate the factories of Essen, the British have loaded their planes with the same incendiary-type bombs the Nazis used so effectively against England during the Blitz. Incendiaries don't just blow up, they start raging fires that incinerate everything in their paths. When the bombers turn toward home, they leave behind an inferno. Throughout the month of May, British bombs continue to fall on cities in the Ruhr Valley. Shortly after the second Essen raid, the British dispatched nearly 600 bombers to pound Dortmund, the forge of Germany. On 11 May, 572 RAF aircraft devastate Duisburg. As May draws to a close, cities all over the region exhibit the scars of continued air raids. The Allies, and in particular the British, are more than pleased. Intelligence reports indicate that the attacks are having a serious impact on the Nazis' industrial output. The operations of hundreds of factories, forges, coal mines, and munitions plants have been drastically slowed or shut down entirely. In addition, huge areas of the targeted cities have been reduced to rubble. It is this last fact that may reveal the one element of failure in this apparent Allied triumph. The seemingly arbitrary nature of the destruction stuns the citizens of the Ruhr and all of Germany. The bombs have destroyed not just factories, but homes and families. For many, the war has been a distant thing, something they read about in the newspaper or heard about on the radio. Now, with their cities laid to waste and friends and family dead, it has become personal. So while the British may have gotten their revenge, they may also have bought themselves a tougher fight. For instead of crushing the German will to wage war, they may have galvanized the German fighting spirit. Advances in technology have played a crucial role in the annals of military history. The chariot, gunpowder, the machine gun, all advanced the art of armed conflict to a new level. While these improvements drastically changed the face of warfare, they did not change its fundamental nature, two opposing forces clashing on a well-defined battlefield. In this war, however, the airplane has utterly demolished this previously accepted law of warfare. Although the airplane played a part in the First World War, its role was limited to reconnaissance, ineffectual bombing, and the romanticism of one-on-one dogfighting. In this war, however, it has been turned into a devastating offensive weapon. No longer is the horror of warfare suffered only by those on the front lines. The civilian populations of entire nations have had the brutal reality of war dropped, literally, in their laps. Although it has become a pivotal part of all nations' armed forces, the Germans were the first to exploit the airplane's potential as a decisive weapon of war. From the moment the Nazis came to power, Adolf Hitler and Hermann Göring began honing the Luftwaffe to be the principal instrument used to crush Europe under their boots and build their 1,000-year Reich. After tearing up the Treaty of Versailles, the Nazis embarked on an ambitious program of rearmament, the centerpiece of which was the Luftwaffe. Factories churned out fleets of warplanes in numbers never before imagined. In 1936, the world was given a glimpse of what was in store as Hitler sent squadrons of his bombers to aid fellow fascist Francisco Franco in the Spanish Civil War. By the time he invaded Poland in September 1939, Hitler had an air force second to none. Not only did they have more planes, the German pilots were flying machines that were faster, more agile, and packed a bigger punch than anything the Poles could muster. Perhaps most terrifying to the hopelessly outmatched Poles was the Junkers 87 dive bomber, better known as the Stuka. Diving on its target, it emits a piercing wail that alone is enough to strike fear in the hearts of those on the ground. Its incredible stability in an almost vertical dive allows it to deliver its bombs with astounding accuracy. The Stuka again demonstrated its deadly efficiency, pounding Allied armor as the Germans streaked across France. In the Battle of Britain, Hitler unleashed his fleets of bombers on the cities of England, and the world, for the first time, saw the horrifying offensive potential of the airplane. The oldest of the German bombers is the glass-nosed Heinkel HE-111. Designed in the early 30s as an airliner, it was quickly adopted by the Luftwaffe and saw extensive service in the Spanish Civil War. During the Battle of Britain, it was mauled by British fighters and quickly became relegated to the role of night bomber, a task which it performed with devastating effectiveness. Bigger, faster, and capable of carrying a larger bomb load than the venerable HE-111 is the Dornier Do-217. Operational in March 1941, the Dornier II has become a familiar sight in the skies over Europe and North Africa. Most versatile and numerous of the German bombers is the Junkers Ju-88. With a top speed of almost 300 miles per hour and capable of delivering over 6,000 pounds of bombs, it was far superior to any Allied bomber early in the war, and with subsequent modifications, is the equal of any in the air today. While these bombers have been the offensive weapons Hitler has used to take the war to the Allies, their success would not have been possible were it not for the support of a pair of world-class fighters, the Messerschmitt Me-109 and the Focke-Wulf 190. Designed in the mid-1930s, production of the Me-109 far and away exceeds that of any other German aircraft. Its role in the Battle of Britain alone has secured it, along with the British Spitfire, a place in history. Fast, agile, and capable of sustaining heavy damage, the Me-109 was, in the early days of the war, the preeminent fighter in the world, and is still a dangerous foe. Slated to replace the Me-109 is the Focke-Wulf 190. When it first appeared in the skies over Britain in 1941, the British were taken completely off guard. Capable of speeds exceeding 400 miles per hour, the Focke-Wulf dominated the skies over Europe for nearly a year, and while the Allies have since equaled its performance, none have surpassed it. Although the Germans introduced the world to the horrific reality of modern aerial warfare, the Allies have been quick studies. They now have their own aerial armadas filling the skies over Germany, forcing the Luftwaffe to fight a defensive war it was never supposed to see. While Hitler and Goering were so certain that their bombers were the tools by which they would claim their place as the masters of Europe, their fighters may be the only thing standing between them and a crushing defeat. Now, don't get me wrong. There's nothing particularly surprising about a soldier having a nice, healthy interest in girls, kind of unofficially, in context, off hours. But now there are those who are concerned, wouldn't be too strong a word, concerned about the moral fiber of our boys over there. Now, it's not that we're being priggish. We understand. Pilots are different from the rest of us, and there's a long history of decorating airplanes. In World War I, the Lafayette Escadrille decorated its planes unofficially with an Indian head. Nothing wrong with that. It builds esprit. We loved how Eddie Rickenbacker, the ace of aces, went into battle sporting a jaunty top hat. The first Americans to serve in World War II, the American Volunteer Group in China, painted shark's teeth on their P-40s. It wasn't long before the locals started calling them flying tiger sharks, which the Americans shortened to flying tigers. That surely was what Secretary of War Henry Stinson had in mind when he decided to allow the individual decoration of aircraft. Build spirit, announce the bold new American presence. Surely he couldn't have been thinking of, well, you talk about a nose for girls. Oh, it's not just girls. There are other things painted by American flyers on their aircraft. There must be something. Oh, yes, there are names. Names of hometowns, names of cartoon characters, and names of girls. The fledgling artists are inspired by Antonio Vargas pinups, by the dream girls of Esquire magazine, and by the Hollywood starlets who are goodwill touring the world. What is amazing is how liberated the artists seem to feel. Good old American boys, far from home, paintbrush in hand. They could paint anything. They paint girls. For the first time in their lives, they are open and cheerful in their licentiousness as they head into battle. When the war ends, is this what we want the world to remember about their American visitors? It's probably too late to do anything about it. The English, saddled with thousands of American flyers, came to the conclusion that Americans have three problems. They are overpaid, oversexed, and over here. It's no wonder. Every time they look up at a passing plane, they see, well, a good deal more than a proper Englishman is used to seeing. Godspeed, boys. You've got a lot of life left to live. But don't forget all those girls back home. "22 April 1943, Tunisia. All across the front, British, American, and French forces opened fire on weary Axis troops, lighting the fuse of Operation Vulcan, the offensive that Allied commanders and soldiers alike hope will be the final nail in the coffin of the Wehrmacht in North Africa. To the northwest, the U.S. Second Corps, under the command of General Omar Bradley, begins advancing into the hills along the coast in an attempt to flank the enemy. The participation of the Americans in this offensive is due only to the intervention of the Commander-in-Chief of Allied forces in North Africa, General Dwight Eisenhower. British General Harold Alexander, commander of Allied ground forces, had planned the operation as an all-British and French affair. The English military, from top to bottom, considered the Americans inferior fighters and would have been quite satisfied to administer the coup de grace on their own. Bradley, seeing that U.S. troops were about to be denied participation in the final victory of the campaign, took his complaint to Eisenhower, who in turn reminded Alexander exactly who was in charge in North Africa. Subsequently, the plans were modified so as to include Bradley's Second Corps. Elsewhere, at the southeast end of the front, the British Eighth Army, under the command of General Bernard Montgomery, begins attacking into the hills that stand between it and the city of Tunis. Montgomery, who shares the commonly held English view of the Americans, is determined that the men of the Eighth, fresh from a rout of the Axis in the western desert, will grab the lion's share of the glory in this final battle. What neither Bradley nor Montgomery realize is that, despite suffering from shortages of food and supplies, the Germans are suffering from no shortage of the will to fight. While the Allies have been positioning for their assault, the Germans have been digging themselves into the hills that run all along their 130-mile defensive perimeter. Guns and mortars placed on mountains and ridges guard roads and valleys. Mines lie in wait in the flatlands. And the orders of German General Jürgen von Arnim that they should fight to the last bullet and the last man ring in the ears of every soldier. From the outset, both the Americans and the British Eighth find themselves struggling. On 23 April, the U.S. 1st Infantry Division, known to the men as the Big Red One, advanced toward their first major objective, an ominous rise known as Hill 609. In front of it lies a wide valley, which quickly garners the moniker the Mousetrap. Any attempted crossing draws deadly accurate fire from German guns stationed on the hill. With tanks and artillery supporting their effort, the men of the 1st begin to move along the rim of the valley toward Hill 609, but with little success. For days, they are able to make only slight advances, and by 26 April, they are completely pinned down by German artillery. Bradley calls in the 34th Infantry Division, commanded by Major General Charles Wolcott Ryder, a hell-raising, tough-as-nails soldier who loves a good fight. The 34th had been the object of particularly derogatory remarks from British brass after their failure to drive the Germans from another hill earlier in the month. Using vindication as an incentive, Bradley tells Ryder that if he takes Hill 609, he'll not only break the back of the enemy's defensive line, he will erase all doubt about the mettle of his men. On the 27th, the 34th attacks toward Jebel El Hara, a village that Bradley believes is the key to taking Hill 609. A heavy barrage from the 2nd Corps artillery is to precede the assault, but is canceled 30 minutes before it is to begin when word is received that the 34th has already stormed the village and driven the enemy off. With Jebel El Hara as a staging area, the 34th, using tanks, guns, and sheer determination, begins moving up the rocky face of Hill 609. The fighting is bloody and bitter. By the end of the next day, the 34th has secured the hill, along with an unassailable reputation for bravery and tenacity. On the other hand, Montgomery and the British 8th are not doing nearly as well. They too are facing hills covered with well-entrenched German guns. The battles are long and bloody, with the Wehrmacht besting the British at nearly every turn. With casualties mounting and his advance bogging down, Montgomery finds himself in the uncomfortable position of having to ask Bradley if he might borrow a regimental combat team from the U.S. 2nd. Bradley responds curtly that only under direct orders from Eisenhower will he dispatch Americans to fight with the English army. Finally, with German guns beating back every attempt to advance, Montgomery is forced to break off the battle and withdraw. When word of the British defeat reaches 2nd Corps headquarters, Omar Bradley, a genial man not prone to reveling in the failures of others, remarks to an aide that perhaps they ought to radio Monty and see if he wouldn't like a few American advisors to show them how to get through those hills. April 1943. British sailors aboard the submarine Seraph depart from Holy Loch on a mission which may be one of the strangest in military history. Aboard is the highest-ranking dead man ever conscripted into the Royal Marines. In the weeks leading up to this mission, known as Operation Mincemeat, the Allied High Command has been busy planning an attack on what Prime Minister Churchill refers to as the soft underbelly of the Axis, Italy. With the defeat of Axis forces in North Africa, Allied planners have turned their attention toward the island of Sicily. Once taken, the island will provide an excellent staging point for attacks on the Italian mainland. This attack is not unexpected by the Axis, and having witnessed the willingness with which the Italian soldiers surrendered in North Africa, Hitler deems it necessary to build up his own troops in Sicily. Allied planners quickly recognized that the rocky crags of Sicily were perfectly suited to a strong defense, and that troops assaulting the island would pay a high price. In spite of this, the plans went forward for the invasion because Allied commanders could find no alternative. That is, until an outlandish plan proposed by Commander Ewan Montagu found its way to the desk of Churchill's Chief of Staff. The plan met with the approval of the Chiefs of Staff, as well as Churchill, and Operation Mincemeat was born. Montagu's plan was to find a body, dress it up as a major in the Royal Marines, place false plans for an Allied invasion of Greece on the body, and see to it that it washed ashore in a place where the Nazis would find it. While some difficulty was encountered in finding an appropriate corpse, one was found, refrigerated, and drafted into the submarine service. Secrecy is of the utmost importance, and most of the men aboard the Seraph do not learn the nature of their bizarre mission even when returning home after releasing Major Martin into the waters off the coast of Huelva, Spain on 30 April. The Chiefs of Staff don't have to wait long to determine if the Major's body has been found, as Spanish officials return him in just a few days, without his attaché case bearing the secret plans. On 13 May, when the case and its contents are returned, British commanders feel certain that the papers have passed under German scrutiny and hope that their plan has worked. Hitler, for one, is convinced that the plans found on Major Martin are genuine and has begun shifting divisions from Sicily to Greece in anticipation of the attack. Mussolini, his instincts right for once, distrusts the plans and argues that forces should be maintained on the island. Hitler responds that the discovered plans simply confirm his earlier suspicion that the Allied attack would come through Greece. His faith is misplaced, or in this case at least, dead men do tell lies. April 1943, Liverpool. 43 merchant ships of Allied convoy ONS-5 set sail for America. Accompanying them are 8 escort ships whose mission it is to safely shepherd the convoy through the U-boat-infested waters of the North Atlantic. While the U-boat wolf packs have, since the outset of the war, been the scourge of British and American shipping efforts, it seems events are turning in the Allies' favor. As the war is worn on, the German U-boats have consistently sunk fewer and fewer Allied ships, while losing ever-increasing numbers of their own. This shift, it seems, is due to 2 factors, the first being awful weather. The fog and rain, so pervasive in the North Atlantic, effectively blind U-boats on the surface and make it nearly impossible to strike the Allies effectively. Working in concert with the weather is the spread of centimetric radar through the Allied fleet, permitting commanders to see the previously invisible submarines, an ability not lost even in the worst weather. Even if his U-boat fleet were operating at maximum strength instead of having nearly half its number in dry dock for repairs, Gross Admiral Karl Dönitz knows the U-boats would need to sink over 1 million tons of Allied shipping per month to have an impact on the war. In recent months, that figure has fallen to less than 250,000. In addition to their increased ability to evade and fight U-boats, the Allies have been producing Liberty ships much faster than the wolf packs could possibly destroy them. Despite his growing fear that his wolf packs will be unable to sufficiently disrupt Allied supply lines, Dönitz insists that the U-boat fleet maintain its aggressive anti-shipping campaign and orders that convoy ONS-5 be the next target. When a 40-sub wolf pack crosses paths with the convoy on 29 April, 500 miles off the coast of Greenland, the pattern of previous months begins to repeat itself. Foul weather forces the subs underwater, and Allied destroyers manage to fend off those submariners who do attempt an attack. The convoy loses only one ship. Dönitz responds to this meager performance by sending the bulk of the force to Ferrer Climbs in the southwest in a search for convoy SC-128, which succeeds in slipping past U-boat positions completely unnoticed. Their service is no longer required in the south. The Wolfpack returns to harass ONS-5. Clear weather on the night of 4 May permits an all-out assault on the convoy by 40 U-boats, which succeed in sinking 5 Allied vessels. On 5 May, fog grants a reprieve to exhausted crews on both sides. As evening falls, however, the Germans renew their assault, attempting 24 separate attacks over the course of the night. By the morning of 6 May, the Germans have sunk 12 Allied vessels, but at a cost of 9 U-boats. In the weeks that follow, the Allies continue to fare well. On 10 May, 4 U-boats are destroyed at the cost of only 4 merchant ships. Dönitz blames his U-boat commanders for the recent disasters. 2 weeks later, it seems Dönitz has had enough, and on 24 May cancels all U-boat activity in the North Atlantic. While the campaign in the Central Atlantic is to continue, this resignation by a commander as bold as Dönitz is something to be celebrated by everyone, but especially by the sailors carrying goods through the now clear waters of the North Atlantic. In the Pacific, it's a war of islands. The Japanese control most of the natural ones, the coral atolls and volcanic remnants that they have been collecting for the last 5 years. The Allies control almost nothing. The islands the Allies fight from are artificial. They have been called cities at sea, but in this war, aircraft carriers are more akin to islands than metropolises. It may seem at first absurd to compare actual points of land to ships, but in this case, the similarities are striking. The strategic value of the Japanese-held islands is not mineral. On the vast majority, there is no oil, coal, or smeltable ore. There is merely enough room for an airstrip, a place from which aircraft might fan out to patrol sea lanes crucial to the war effort. To do that, these islands have become home to close communities dedicated to a single end, the delivery of aircraft. So it is with the American aircraft carriers. Like the islands, they're small, just large enough for a single airstrip. And like the islands, for them to do their job, they are dependent on a small community that can minister not just to the needs of aircraft, but to the people who support them. Life aboard an American carrier is shaped not so much by war as it is by all the same social forces that have shaped America. With more than 3,000 crewmen aboard, the ship has a class structure, an economy, and mass media to disseminate information. The people who make the island's existence possible labor anonymously far below deck. Everything a carrier does is dependent on power, and all of that power comes from the boiler room. The boiler room is a hot, greasy place, the factory floor of the carrier. But its existence makes life on the rest of the ship possible. The crew lives a few decks above the boilers. Theirs is a compact but not uncomfortable existence, not unlike that of the Japanese island dwellers they've come to fight. There are hot meals to be had, with fresh vegetables and bread just out of the oven. There are barber shops, drugstores, and wardrooms for recreation. The crewman can take in a movie or find a little quiet time for reading or writing letters home. One's social class on a carrier is determined by one's proximity to aircraft. The crewmen who work with the planes are higher up the ladder than those who don't. The plane captains, responsible for the care of specific aircraft, are the highest of the non-flyers. But it is the pilots who are the princes of the aircraft carrier. It is their lives that are, to the men below, almost blessed. In quiet times, it seems almost unfair. The white tablecloths and attentive stewards recall a pleasure cruise more than they do life in wartime. But quiet times on a carrier do not last. And when battle approaches, the dining rooms give way to briefing rooms, and the pilots must go out and fight. During battle, the entire character of the community changes. The cook becomes an anti-aircraft gunner. The barber becomes a bomb loader. The peaceable kingdom becomes what it was intended to be: closed, protected, deadly. And the pilots cease to be shipboard gourmands and become what they have always been: warriors. Everyone on the carrier cooperates to throw the planes forward into battle. On the tight confines of the flight deck, no mistakes can be tolerated. The planes are heavy with fuel and ordnance. One tiny misdirection could mean the death of the entire community. It is amazing, somehow, that the planes ever get into the air. But they do. With the aircraft gone, the carrier takes on a curious hollowness. The community remaining is left to wait, hoping for some report of the action, some word of friends and familiar faces doing battle far out to sea. Word comes. The enemy has been engaged. Fighting is heavy. Targets are hit. But the information that everyone is waiting for, the information on losses, comes only when the planes begin to return. Sometimes they come back flushed with victory. Others limp back, damaged though not defeated. Some, inevitably, are lost. The wounded are hurried below decks to waiting hospital beds, to the best medical care the island has to offer. As the artificial island moves on through another period of quiet to the next battle, repairs are made to both men and machines. The white tablecloths come out again, and the decks cease to be scenes of carnage. So it will be on America's Pacific Islands, because if there is one profound difference between the artificial islands and the natural ones, it is this. When the action passes a natural island by, that island is at peace. When the action passes an aircraft carrier, word goes down to the boiler room to bring up the steam, for the island is moving on to the next battle.